much to the Terrapin team for having me here. I'm excited to share with you some of the U.S. research. For those of you who may not be familiar with Forrester Research, Forrester is a technology research company based in the Boston area in the U.S., and I've specifically been focusing on e-commerce and online retail. And I'm going to basically start at a very, very high level by sharing with you three of the biggest developments and changes that we've observed. One of them is not going to be any shock or surprise to you. It's the explosion of mobile. This is actually data from Cisco on just the amount of mobile data that has been growing in the entire world. And as you can see, that figure is more than doubled just in the last kind of year alone. And at Forrester, what we do is we describe this as the mobile mind shift. And there's a sort of that expression that we've coined. We actually wrote a book on it. But it's basically it's the following. It's the expectation that any desired information or service is available on any device in any context when you need it. So you hear over and over again these examples like the on-demand services, Uber, Google, anybody providing you what you need, whether it's on a mobile device or a wearable device, a watch, any format at any time. And what we end up with is a scenario like this, which is that technology ultimately ends up getting used anywhere and everywhere. And what has really changed is the fact that we now have more time spent on the internet, and more of that time is used everywhere. And this is just some data points. We have consumers responding to us on where they use these various devices, and it's broken up by phones and tablets. And as you can see, the percent of consumers that use their devices is very high, whether it's in the home, outside of the home, or on the go as people may be commuting or going from location to location. And that's consistent whether you're talking about larger devices or smaller devices. But the larger point is that there is an enormous growth in just the number of access points and the time that people are spending on these various devices. And you end up with, I don't know if you've seen kind of this particular image, but I thought it was very funny. It's a road in China where consumers are so now used to having that phone everywhere that kind of you're often texting and walking at the same time, and it's such a distraction. They've created a text-only kind of phone zone, and kind of a no-phone zone for those, so that you can go to where you need to go more efficiently. The second big theme is this trend of hyper adoption. And what we mean by that is just that every single product, whether it's a device or a service, ends up now getting into more homes, getting to more consumers faster than they ever have before, and certainly mobile is part of that. So these are just a couple of data points. We have, kind of prior to hyper adoption, a good example, a good proxy would be the adoption of MP3 players, and that is the bottom graph. And when MP3 players were introduced, you got about 4% penetration. 4 years later, you end up getting, small double-digit penetration. Contrast that with tablets, which are in that post-mobile era, where the adoption in the inception was a little bit lower, but by year 4 you end up with close to 50% adoption. So very, very rapid growth in a short period of time, and it's even more pronounced in products and services where the adoption is often digital. And I thought that this was really interesting because it's basically the number of years that something, since inception, that a product, the number of users that product has at a point in time. And what you'll see is that for some of those older products, like a Flash or an Outlook, where they achieve their growth after nearly 20 years, there are now services and products that in half that time are achieving that same amount of growth. So what that means for retail is that you see a lot of startups growing very, very quickly in a very short period of time, getting to $100 million US, sometimes even $1 billion in sales in a very, very short period of time. Now, what that also means is that there's hyper churn as well that companies need to worry about, because the attention span of customers is constantly so short, and there's that ability to find a substitute relatively quickly. But this idea of hyper adoption has completely transformed the investments that people make and how good you need to be out of the gate in order to achieve that success. The third big theme is that all of that, both the mobile device and this theme of hyper adoption, has led to the explosion, of course, of online retail, because more consumers now have more choice than ever before. They have more access to the internet than they've ever had before, and they have the ability to get greater selection than they've ever had before. And what we have here is a composite of about 17 different e-commerce forecasts that Forrester does every year, and I've aggregated into 4 different markets. And what we have is that by around 2020, we'll likely see $1 trillion in e-commerce sales alone. And in virtually every market, we're seeing double-digit year-over-year growth, which of course is much, much bigger than physical store growth. And what that means is that consumers are shifting those dollar sales away from the physical store channel to the online channel. And as I'd said before, there are some significant reasons that consumers choose to shop online, often because it provides better value. And the biggest reasons are convenient selection and often price. And that's really what we have here, is some data points from consumers and market research that Forrester's conducted, asking shoppers, why do you choose to shop online? What are the drivers of why you shop? And in many cases, it is about a product assortment. The number one reason being I cannot find products I can find products online that I can't find anywhere else, or I save time by shopping online. So these are really, really big deals, because these are the things that enable shoppers to really find that value from the web channel. Now, the other important thing that has been a significant driver in e-commerce is how much the competition and the competitive landscape, particularly for pure plays that are really, really good, has forced the service levels to be higher. And the service levels, I would argue, in e-commerce are better than in any other industry. So what we have here is essentially a framework that we've created at Forrester, where we talk about the customer experience and how competitive that customer experience is in certain industries. And in online commerce in particular, that competitive landscape is more heated than anywhere else, in large part because anyone can access the internet, and prices are often very, very competitive. The offering is very, very competitive. And as a result of that, and because consumers have so much ability to choose and switch, you have this constant arms race to get better and better service. On the other hand, in physical retail, you tend to have, particularly for larger retailers, less of that competition, because once a consumer is in a physical store, that ability to necessarily find an item elsewhere, that switching cost is a little bit higher once you've trapped somebody in that physical store. And in other regulated industries where consumers just don't have as much choice, you don't have a lot of that ability to switch either. So we're talking about a hyper-competitive retail environment where consumers have access to so much. In the United States alone, there are nearly 1 million web stores that consumers can find, and that creates a significant amount of tension in that retail environment. And what you have is often a dynamic like what we're seeing here, where there's certain pure plays that may exceed the growth levels of everyone else, in large part because they are so hyper competitive and they have created such a valuable offering. And this is just data, again, from the US on some of the largest players. And some of the interesting things are those numbers are certainly not increasing. They're sort of, kind of trending downward across the board. But what you have is you have a pure play, in this case like Amazon.com, which is exceedingly better than, from a growth standpoint, than a lot of the other players in the space that are trending downward, in large part because they're losing share to the e-commerce channel. Now, overall, what we're also seeing from an e-commerce standpoint is just the amount of online influence across virtually every category. So this is essentially the composite of all of Forrester's e-commerce forecasts, and we forecast for approximately 15 different physical goods categories. And what you see here, there are a few observations that I make when I look at this data. The first is that there is a downward sloping trend, and just to kind of recap, we have on the x-axis, you have the percent of that particular category that is transacted online. So the further to the right you are, the higher percent of that category's sales are transacted online. On the y-axis, you have the percent of research that happens online. So if a category is not actually transacted online, it's nonetheless influenced by digital channels because consumers are still researching it online. So you have on the far right a lot of those digital goods categories like software or music or books that tend to be on the right-hand side. But even categories like grocery, which tend to not be as transacted online, nonetheless are increasingly influenced by e-commerce. They're increasingly influenced by websites that communicate that data and that information. Now, all of this, though, is going to vary tremendously from market to market, and I want to bring it to to the Middle East and some of the factors and the influences that we're seeing here as well. So in the United States, we see about $300 billion in e-commerce happening online. And what that ultimately ends up being is several $100s per capita for the most digitally advanced e-commerce markets. And what we have again at Forrester, what we've created is something called a digital readiness index, which is that second column, which is basically a number that is assigned to most of the markets in the world on how digitally advanced that market is. And that is a composite of a number of things that I'll show you, but it's basically the percent of consumers in that market that have internet connectivity, that may have mobile payments familiarity, what percent of sellers in that market are enabled for digital commerce, and you have the US and the UK being at the top of the list, but you end up with lower numbers as you get to more emerging markets. The most advanced probably of all of the Middle Eastern markets is Israel, which we give a 35 to. But the things that I think are interesting are the per capita figures, because that essentially tells you what you can estimate the size of retail in that market to be from an e-commerce standpoint. So in the US, you have several $100s, nearly $1,000 per person being spent online in the e-commerce channel. As you move further down the list, when you talk about emerging markets like India or even Brazil, we're talking about $2 to $25 US per capita. So if you look at a market like UAE, you have maybe 9 to 10 million consumers, and you're probably looking at a per capita spend level that may be optimistically around $20. That's probably a good estimate of how much the e-commerce is until you have other factors that can accelerate the growth of online selling in those markets. And basically, this is the composite of how we calculate that score. It's basically all of these things, everything from social media usage to what percent of consumers have credit cards. Now, one of the things that I think is important to also keep in mind is that how digital evolves in different markets. And what we typically see is a phased approach where you start with security concerns and ultimately people become much more familiar and comfortable with transactions. But really, it's also the categories that people start with. So online banking is actually a catalyst for driving people to e-commerce and making them comfortable. And then you go in those initial categories, particularly in media categories online, and then in the later phases of online selling, you get to more subjective categories where touch and feel can sometimes be very, very critical. And when you look at which markets are sort of kind of fall into each category, we have most of those Western countries, often the English-speaking countries where a lot of websites, of course, started in English on that right-hand side. And then you have those emerging markets, and I would put UAE in that level, for now, and even other parts of the Middle East maybe will be in those initial phases of e-commerce, like Turkey or even Israel, are sort of in that initial phase of getting to media products being sold online and then kind of accelerating them to the next level as well. Now, a significant part of what we see in e-commerce, particularly where the suppliers in a market are not as robust as you may see otherwise, is a significant amount of cross-border commerce. So this is data, I won't get into kind of all of the specifics, it comes from PayPal, on the percent of consumers in various markets that say they actually purchase e-commerce products from across their border, so from other markets. So everything in blue is basically those markets where there is that cross-border connectivity, and then what's in the box there are the Middle Eastern markets that they looked at. So that's a significant part of the story around the world and also in emerging markets. Now, often also, in addition to that phase 3 approach, what we also see is marketplaces being an enormous catalyst for initiating people to the e-commerce experience. And here are just, it's very interesting because even in the United States, when e-commerce started, you had a dominant portion of e-commerce being eBay, and now you have a significant portion being Amazon, which is also a marketplace. But in all of these emerging markets, the single biggest players in e-commerce tend to be these aggregators of sellers who are very focused on facilitating payments and making sure that seller ratings are aggregated, and essentially creating a destination for shoppers to go to create that great shopping experience. When you look at a market like China, it's very interesting because even though marketplaces are, there's increasing competition that the marketplaces have, at this moment in time, the vast majority of Chinese e-commerce is purely through Alibaba and that combination of Tmall and Taobao driving a significant portion of it, hundreds of billions of dollars, hands down the single biggest e-commerce force in the entire world. That said, there are issues that always come to mind, particularly with respect to emerging markets. And as you're thinking of, well, what are the ways that you can accelerate that digital readiness to get from kind of some of those lower double-digit scores to even a mid or a high double-digit score? What are some of the things that any market really needs to overcome, and particularly their opportunities in the Middle East, and what can you do with some of the challenges that exist? And the challenges that we typically see are these 4. One is issues related to infrastructure and web speed, which are often not as fast as is necessary to create a completely seamless web experience. That's issue 1, and that becomes even harder as more consumers are accessing devices on small screens. 2 is sometimes literacy and language can be an issue. This is definitely a factor in markets like India and Brazil, because what you end up with is a relatively small portion of the population doing all of the online spending. And particularly in markets where a lot of the sellers in cross-border, for instance, are only selling in English, that often poses a big challenge to helping to socialize and evangelize e-commerce to the broader population. 3 is online payments options. And as you know, in every market in the world, payments are different. And just because you have credit cards and debit cards, it can facilitate cross-border and it can facilitate transacting in certain markets, but isn't always the best way to pay for every single product that you can. And then the 4th issue is issues around profitability and really managing to get products to consumers in a way where you are still making money and you're still preserving margin opportunity. And what we see are a handful of things that are absolutely essential to keep in mind. First is you want to develop simple, mobile-friendly websites. And typically, this is where marketplaces are really good. They don't have the prettiest websites. They don't even have the most attractive websites, or even websites that are necessarily fantastic from a user interface standpoint, but they're functional. They have a lot of text, And that text can often, that's generally all that consumers need to really complete those transactions. And they also have very, very simple flow from kind of the beginning to the end of the transaction. Their searches, on-site search is very simple. They're well optimized from a marketing standpoint for Google search or any other inbound marketing vehicle that they may have. Second, with respect to really addressing the idea of the complexity of e-commerce and speed is you got to curate particularly well and make that flow as easy as possible. This is an academic study that some professors at Wharton Business School and the University of Pennsylvania in the United States pulled together. And it's a fascinating, fascinating study on how people make choices and when do they pick more items. And what we have here is different sets of examples. You have an assortment of jelly beans, so candy in this case, that was organized and disorganized. And they did the study with children and they did the study with adults. And basically they found that people pick more when your selection is organized. So I just think that that's an important and interesting insight, particularly as your assortment gets larger. So in e-commerce, of course, your assortment has to be large. It should be large. People expect it to be large, and you want to organize it as best as you can. So really, really curate well and filter things in a way that is good for people. Another kind of takeaway here that's incredibly important is to really think about using good data. And what I mean by that, so this is a framework that we have at Forrester. It's called our Tech Radar, and there are a few axes here. It has essentially where a technology is on kind of the scale from birth to death, and how much value it has is on the y-axis. And these are retail data technologies that are used by retailers to improve their business. And what you see is that there's actually a lot of retail technology that's in the middle that kind of it's sort of average utility to retailers, but there's some stuff that retailers really find a lot of value from. Things like warehouse management systems, and by that, that's helped enable omni-channel fulfillment and shipping from store capabilities. There are things like dynamic pricing, which is becoming increasingly popular in the age of the internet. So that's up there on that blue part of the chart, which is really, really high value. You have things like online loss prevention tools, which I would include as some of the ways to prevent fraud online, which are huge in terms of improving the margins of e-commerce stores. You also want to do things like reacting quickly to the market and being very, very dynamic in how you engage. And one of the powerful things about the internet is, of course, your ability to react in real time, which in the real world, in physical retail, you have a promotion, often it's months ahead. At best, you can change things out on a daily basis because you have to communicate it to a store associate and they have to go physically make a change. Online, you can make those changes in real time, yet what we're seeing is that only a minority of marketers are even reacting. So this is data about search in Google. And essentially we talk to retail decision makers in a number of markets in the US and Europe, and what we see is that over 50% take days to make their changes on paid search, or their data isn't updated in real time, or that it's not necessarily usable all the time. And this is just low-hanging fruit, is your ability to react to holidays or inventory information, to adjust what you're promoting, for instance, on Google search, which is the single biggest way that consumers are still finding content in retail. Another opportunity with respect to search is to cast that net in search as wide as possible. What we have here is, again, those same decision makers saying that only half of their inventory they're even exposing in paid search results. So I thought that was just really, really interesting, is if you're only exposing half, how are people even going to find you otherwise, particularly in a crowded internet environment where there's so much choice that if you're not promoting yourself, somebody else will be, and that's who's ultimately going to gain that sale. From a developing market standpoint, some of the things that are incredibly important are also doing things like empowering local merchants, particularly when you're dealing with some of those issues regarding language and literacy. So this is a really, really interesting experiment that Amazon has going on in India. So India is a market where, of course, there are lots of language issues, and there is a significant portion of the population that may not speak English and certainly can't read English. But we know that that population nonetheless has an interest in purchasing products that are in the long tail. And what Amazon actually does is they provide devices to local stores to actually be the POS interface that connects to Amazon. So people come in and then they will order through the shopkeeper in that local market, and the shopkeeper places the order. So so that's how they kind of circumvent that need for being able to have the internet connectivity and the language skills as well. Other opportunities are providing those same capabilities for the local merchant themselves to stock their own shelves. So this is an example that Infosys had going on in India with a product called Trade Edge, where it's essentially a web-enabled system to not even just order from Amazon, but to order from anyone, anywhere, particularly their suppliers that are able to offer the entire assortment of their catalog. Leveraging social networks is another big opportunity. This is an example in Brazil, where there is a retailer called Magazine Luiza that basically offers the ability for its shoppers to have a social network for its customers, and then the customers basically sell to other customers. They sell to their friends products from Magazine Luiza, and everything they sell ends up being sold through Magazine Luiza, and the customer gets a commission. At this point, I think it's like 10% of their online sales go through that format. You also want to think from a payment standpoint about reducing friction wherever possible. And one of the things that we see, particularly in emerging markets like India and even Russia, is cash on payment, or even alternative delivery or alternative payment options, like even kind of any type of blockchain technology, for instance, that can authenticate a transaction and kind of hold funds in escrow until the actual product can be received. One of the last things are integrating omni-channel and digital capabilities into stores. So things like click and collect options, or in-store pickup, or even ship from store capabilities are incredibly valuable. These are just some of the examples that we see in different markets around the world, where people actually drive up to kind of a parking lot, and consumers or a store associate will come and bring the shopping cart of items to customers. We have other examples of drive-throughs in different parts of the world, like Walmart and Chrono Drive, which is a part of Auchan in France. So I'm just going to wrap up here, and I think that we may have a minute or two for questions, but just to summarize, mobile really enables hyper adoption, and new business opportunities are constantly emerging as a result of that mobility and the hyper adoption that come from consumer behavior. It's harder than ever, of course, to retain and even acquire customers as a result of that hyper adoption and hyper churn. So that's why that easy digital presence is absolutely essential. You need to make payments as simple as possible for customers, wherever possible, maybe even having cash on delivery options, or particularly in emerging markets. And my last point is really to empower local merchants who can be your partners in driving sales. So with that, I will wrap up. This is my email address, first initial, last name @Forrester, for anyone who may want a copy of the presentation that won't get it through the Terrapin team. And that's my Twitter handle if you want to follow me on Twitter.